Friends, we are gathered here to release the book in memory of Amit Sengupta and also have a panel discussion of which he would have been the speaker today if it was not for his demise in this tragic way. So we have put together this book mainly to remember his writings, the work that he had done, and also to remind ourselves in the current times, what is it that we should be doing in order to fill the void that he has left us with. His words are there, his work is there for us to take at least the struggle that he fought on forward. I'm going to start with handing this book release, which is what we are here for, to Sudhanva Deshpande, who's, of course, as you know, runs Leftword. He's the managing editor of Leftword and the publisher of Leftword. So Sudhanva, over to you for the release of the book.
Thank you very much, Prabir. I'm reminded that when Leftword Books started in 1999, the very first editorial board meeting that we had, and two of the members of that editorial board are with us this evening, Comrade Chintan and Professor Prabhat Patnaik. They might recall that one of the first book proposals that we had thought about was a book on public health by Dr. Amit Sengupta. And we had spoken to him, we had commissioned him to do the book, and he had said that he would write it. And of course, every time that one asked him, he would say, yes, I'm engaged with this particular project or this campaign or, this meeting and so on. And that as soon as this is over, I'll deliver the book to you. And this became a running joke over 20 years with Comrade Amit, who was incredibly prolific in terms of his activism and also his intellectual output. But it's sad that in his lifetime, we were never able to really get the book out of him. So it's a very special and great pleasure for us at Leftword Books. It's an honor for us to publish this book, Political Journeys in Health. And I'm very glad that I'm joined today by Comrade Chintan for this sort of virtual book release. Comrade Sitaram, you have known, you knew Comrade Amit for a very long time. And could you share with us a little bit about Amit that you knew, about his activism, about his intellectual work, but really also as a human being, as a person, as a friend?
Well, thank you. Thank you. You asked me to release this collection of essays by and for Amit. It's, of course, a great pleasure to release it, but it's also a pain to release it because of the manner in which he went too early. Well, literally, Amit and I grew up together in the student movement from the late 1970s onwards, post-emergency, after we fought and we came out. And since then, there was no looking back, in the sense that the objective was very clear. What is it that we want to achieve? A new world, a better India, and based on a social order where exploitation of man by man ends. And within this larger frame was Amit's entire body of work. And I think that, he was a trained doctor. He would keep up to date with whatever latest scientific information was going on. He would, in fact, even contribute to many of them, if not formally, of course, with a lot of informally. But most importantly, he would use that knowledge for building up a people's movement. It was a people's intervention to create an awareness that there should be a universal health care, and that is the responsibility of society at large, not only of any one particular government or the other. And this movement, a people's movement, in that he played a very, very important role. And that's why I said he left too early. And in today's time, when the whole world is facing this COVID pandemic, when we are facing this pandemic with extremely, unplanned manner in which our government and authorities are going about facing this and creating consequential problems to the people's livelihood and the miseries that are there. Amit would have been a voice that was most required at this particular juncture. And even personally, there was anything, all of us sitting here, in this panel today, for anything, any doubt we had, we'd always first call Amit. During this period of lockdown, there have been innumerable cases of our comrades getting false alarms about whether they've got this coronavirus or not. They had fever, they would have dysentery, they would have diarrhea, they'd have something, and then, there would be total panic. But a voice, which was a scientific voice, would have told us that this won't be there. That voice somehow is missing, and that is the human loss that is there. And so I'm very glad that this collection of essays has come today, and I'm very glad that it has been put together by Prabir, who's known him for also equally long period of time that I did, Indranil and Richa Chintan. And I think, I would like to congratulate the Leftword books for having published this, and the authors and the contributors who really have contributed to this volume. Finally, I would only like to say that Amit, you were right about his writing a book. I've made him write innumerable articles, but you always have to follow it up with him. And it's not a question of blaming him, the question of apportioning time and concentrating what to do when. He would take anything on that would come, which was in the people's interest, in the interest of the movement. And that was Amit. In one sense, extremely focused, in one sense, very eclectic and very anarchic. But at the same time, his output was something that you could measure, not only in terms of intellectual contributions, but also in terms of strengthening the popular people's movements. That's why he was a comrade in arms. He left us very soon, too early, much too early. And that will be a void. But it's now left to all of us to try and together fill that void. And I think this publication will help in focusing back on this issue of creating a universal public healthcare system in India as a part and parcel of a larger agenda of changing this exploitative society that we have in order to create a better India. And I think that is the only way in which Amit will be remembered all through by all of us. So I have, once again, as I said, both pleasure and pain in releasing this book. So thank you all for asking me to release this book. And thanks again to the authors, the contributors, and the publishers, the Leftword books, for bringing this volume together, publishing it, and releasing it. Thank you.
Sadalwa.
Thank you very much, Comrade Sitaram. As you said, it's a great pleasure to be doing this book. I should just say also, for the benefit of our viewers, that the book is already available on the Leftword website as an ebook. You can buy it there, you can download it from our website. But as soon as the pandemic sort of situation allows us, we are committed to bringing out the book in print as well. The problem really is not so much that the printers are not ready to print. Printers are getting back slowly, but they're getting back. The main problem right now is that supply chains are hugely disrupted. And so we don't want to print the book and just have it lying in our go down. And so as soon as we know that supply chains are back in some kind of shape, we are committed to bring this book out in print as well. But in the meanwhile, those of you who are interested can go to the Leftword website. That's leftword.com, leftword.com, and you will see this book on our homepage. You can click, you can read about the book, and you can also watch a small promotional video about the book on the site, and you can buy and download the book from there. Prabir?
Yes, I think you have talked about also both Sitaram and you about Amit and books. This other part of Amit which I should present here, not as a defense, but just to complete the picture, there are a number of books he wrote, but unfortunately, they were not in his name. So he was also the other person who was quite happy to have books come, and that's what mattered. And if it came anonymously as a collective, it didn't matter to him that he was not the editor or the author, but it was the work of the collective. That's something as a principle of work, which is a very rare one indeed.
I know. And you know as well as I do, Prabir, that he was most self-efficacious person. I mean, he would rather not have his name on it. He said, as long as the content is there, he'll be more than happy.
Yes,
I mean, that's his character. Very, very sterling character.
in fact, in any major event that we would organize, his happiest moment would be the back room. That's what he really loved, and not going on stage, which we had to force him and
Push him.
to the forefront, because sometimes it was important that he be there. I'm going to now ask Arijit, because Amit's family has instituted a memorial fellowship in his name, and we have also a person who has been awarded that fellowship as of yesterday. So Arijit, will you speak a few words on this?
Yeah, thank you so much, Comrade Prabir. I would like to say that since the past few months, the world has been struggling with this coronavirus pandemic. And in times like this, the absence of people like Dr. Amit Sengupta is felt all the more greater. The past few months have made it all the more clear for all of us that the struggle for the right to health is intricately linked with the struggle for emancipation of mankind in general. And that is why, on behalf of his family and along with the Jan Swasthya Abhiyan and People's Health Movement, we decided to launch and make the announcement for the Dr. Amit Sengupta Fellowship for the Right to Health. We believe that his legacy must live on to make health accessible to the people in service of the people, and to reach out to those that have been denied the right to health because of an unjust social order. This year, as soon as the call for applications was done for this fellowship, the response was overwhelming, and a huge number of applications came within a very short period of time. And that's why it was all the more difficult to decide as to who to award the fellowship. But we collectively came to the conclusion that Harendra, an activist from Bilaspur, be awarded. He works with the Jan Swasthya Sahyog in Ganyari, Bilaspur. He has been working since 2013 as a field coordinator for community health program. Prior to that, he worked with Central Himalayan Rural Action Group, Simail, Nainital, Uttarakhand. Harendra has postgraduate degrees in social work and archaeology. Under the fellowship, Harendra will work on denial of healthcare due to COVID-19 crisis in Bilaspur. He will document and analyze cases of denial and their impact on health outcomes. He will have his findings published in the press and also organize people and generate awareness about their health rights, with focus on vulnerable sections.
So we have on the screen, if we can see Harendra, who is with us, who is going to be the person who is going to have this fellowship. And we hope that with this fellowship and every year our ability to give this fellowship, that we would get many more people who will be a part of the health activist movement. I'm going to start now the panel discussion. And before that, I have to introduce the three panelists who are here. So I know that Comrade Sitaram is a very busy person. We have stolen his valuable time out of his schedule here. Today is a Sunday, so hopefully he has a less busy schedule. So if he wants to, Sitaram, if you want to go, it's okay. There is no big issue that you're doing something disrespectful for us. Okay. So we understand.
Thank you. But I still have the possibility of staying on, no?
Yes, you have.
That's it. Good.
Okay. So now I'm going to start the panel discussion, because the idea of the panel discussion is that when we are planning the book, we didn't really think about COVID-19 or this pandemic which would hit us, this novel coronavirus, as it has been called, or SARS-CoV-2. So now, given that, obviously a lot more challenges have come up. Not that these challenges were not there. There were challenges which existed in any case. But the challenges have sharpened or at least come in new forms under this extremely uh, unusual circumstance of a pandemic. Though we have had pandemics earlier, but the largest global pandemic was really what is called the Spanish flu pandemic, which probably started from Kansas. But nevertheless, that's probably the pandemic which people remember. Though plague, we still remember in India, which was there till about early 40s, even up to early 50s. So it's not that the pandemics have not been there in other parts of the world, but a global pandemic of this nature was an unusual circumstance that has come upon us. Now, we have three speakers, but before I go on to three speakers, I would like Richa and Indranil also to turn their video on so people can at least see the other editors. And if those who are technically organizing this can show at least Richa and Indranil, so people know who the other editors are. As you know, they're the younger people. They should have done most of the work and have indeed done it. Okay, so coming back to this panel discussion, I'm going to start with Professor Prabhat Patnaik. That, of course, again, in this among this audience, perhaps he does not need an introduction. He has been one of the leading political economy thinkers, not only here, but also in the world. And I think for us to know how the economic crisis that has been unfolding for some time, what shape it is likely to take place with the pandemic, I think is something that we would really like to know. And if you can share with us what you think are what's the nature of the current crisis, in what way does the pandemic play on that crisis?
Thank you, Prabir. First of all, I'm very grateful that I have been asked to be a panelist so that I can pay my homage to Dr. Amit Sengupta. This book is being released at a time which is really quite appropriate in a sense, because many of the things which Amit actually stood for in his life are things which are being vindicated today. One such, which Comrade Sitaram referred to, is the absolute necessity for universal public health care. As a matter of fact, even in European countries which have universal public health care, or more or less universal public health care, there is no doubt that in the period after 2008 financial crisis, there has been a neglect of the public healthcare system. There has been per capita real health expenditure has really not gone up very much. As a matter of fact, the proportion of GDP going for public health is something which has more or less remained stagnant. But this stagnation itself is symptomatic of a crisis, because meanwhile, over much of Europe, the proportion of the old in total population has gone up. The prices of drugs have gone up relative to the general wholesale price index or GDP deflator. And also you have had new kinds of treatments like gene therapy and so on, which are much more expensive. So really speaking, even maintaining a percentage of GDP going for public health expenditure is something which has been quite inadequate in Europe. And as is well known, whether it's in England or in Italy or in France, the public healthcare system was really extremely overstretched when the pandemic hit. But in countries like India, where public health expenditure has been shamefully and disastrously paltry, it has been about 1% of GDP now for more than 15 years. In 2004-5, it was 0.9%. And even today, it is about 1.2%. So you can imagine that in countries like ours, there has been a total neglect of public health. And it's not surprising that the poor people are having to pay a price for it. And this is a pandemic which cannot really be confined to the poor. One of the remarkable things about this pandemic is that even if the poor get hit, then in the process, the rich too cannot avoid the consequences of it. It is something which affects everybody, and therefore the need for a universal public health care has been underscored by this pandemic in a way that earlier it may not have been clear. So in that sense, it's a vindication of someone, of what someone like Amit had stood for all his life. But additionally, there's something more I want to talk about, and that too, in a sense, is a vindication of the kind of thing that Amit would have liked to see. And that is the following, that the pandemic in a flash, in a brilliant flash, has really highlighted something which was becoming clear to many even before the pandemic. And that consists in the fact that the neoliberal economic order, which had been in place for the previous 4 decades, if not more, was something which was coming to a dead end. In other words, it's not as if after the pandemic we can actually go back. After the pandemic induced or the lockdown induced crisis, we can, as it were, simply go back to the old normal, but the old normal itself has really collapsed. Now, this is something which is not just my view. This is not just a person of the left who's actually saying it, but this is something which actually the more insightful, the more prescient elements of the bourgeoisie, in other words, the kind of, if you like, the thinkers, the writers, and so on, are also beginning to feel even within the establishment. This, for instance, has been expressed in a number of editorials in the Financial Times on April 3rd, May 8th, and so on. And this is something which also gets expressed in places like New York Times and so on. Now, what they are suggesting, and I completely agree with it, is that, or what I should say what even they are suggesting, something which I agree with, namely that capitalism has now reached, like in the 1930s, its sort of Keynes-Roosevelt moment, where basic intervention by the state is essential to get capitalism out of the crisis, because the kind of capitalism that existed before, in which the state was asked to keep off intervention, is something that is no longer going to work. In particular, there are 4 areas in which, according to bourgeois writers and thinkers, there has to be a rollback of the old neoliberal order. One is that there has to be a substantial public intervention, including public investment. You may have seen the other day that Boris Johnson actually said that in Britain, I would like public investment to increase in order to stimulate the economy. And he began his comments by saying, please believe me, I'm not a communist. But even he said that it is important to have public investment to boost the economy. The second area in which the old order, as it were, the prescient elements of the establishment recognized must change, is public provisioning of essential services, particularly healthcare and, of course, education. Now, this is something in which, again and again, you find references that this simply cannot be taken to be an area in which the government is supposed to earn any rate of return and so on. This is non-commercial, and therefore is very important for the state to play a leading role in this. The third area in which, again, there is a recognition for change is the need for a reduction in income and wealth inequalities. And this is something which many others have been saying. I'm not even talking about figures of the financial establishment, but even, other economists, social democratic economists like Piketty and others have been saying this for a long time. The IMF has been saying this for a long time. And you find that the World Economic Forum has been saying this for a long time. None of them is known for left-wing views, but the necessity for a reduction in income and wealth inequalities is something which is again emphasized, even as it were within the establishment and around the establishment. The fourth area in which there is a recognition, again, for change is the need for enlarging labor rights. That essentially you have to ensure that the rights of labor are respected. Now, these are areas in which, if you are going to have change, and all these people argue that there must be change, because otherwise, their argument is that in order to preserve capitalism, in order to preserve what they call individual freedom, it is important for the state to intervene. That state intervention is not antithetical to individual freedom, but it's something that actually is conducive to, promotes individual freedom, exactly the kind of argument that, for instance, John Maynard Keynes had advanced in the 1930s. Now, while this is something which is widely recognized, and this is an agenda which nobody from the left can possibly disagree, where the difference arises is the belief that this is something which can be actually brought about under capitalism, because contemporary capitalism is characterized by the hegemony of globalized finance. Now, in order to introduce any of these measures, you really have to shake the hegemony of globalized finance. Finance is not going to agree to all these measures, and therefore you have got a battle on your hands. Now, what, let's say, the Financial Times believes, or what the New York Times believes, is that finance would see the wisdom of bringing about these changes in order to maintain the durability of the system, exactly what John Maynard Keynes had argued in the 1930s, that really, if only the capitalists saw that, look, this is essential to ensure the stability of capitalism, then they would withdraw their opposition to it. But nonetheless, between the 1930s, when he advanced his views, and the post-Second World War period, when there was state intervention, you had to have a world war in order to shake the hegemony of finance capital that had existed until that time. Therefore, while the agenda that they're putting forward is an agenda that would be broadly acceptable to anybody on the left, the real issue is that in order to push that agenda forward, in order to implement that agenda, it would become important to take on the hegemony of finance. It would be important to struggle against finance capital. And today's finance capital is globalized finance capital. This struggle is not going to be an easy one. And this struggle would engage the working class all over the world. It will engage the working people in countries of third world, peasantry, and so on. And that being the case, when they are mobilized, then they are not going to simply stop at, as it were, having a reformed capitalism, but they would go further. In other words, there is going to be an intensification of class struggle against the hegemony of finance, and that intensification would have consequences far greater, far beyond what even those elements in the establishment who are prescient enough to see the need for having a reformed capitalism are willing to visualize, or willing to tolerate, or willing to accept. Now, that is one side of the story. The other side is that you find that in countries like ours, you find that even this kind of a reform agenda is not even being talked about. Everything that the Modi administration is doing is the very opposite of, as I said, what the prescient elements of the establishment in the West, of the metropolitan establishment, see as being essential. Instead of, for instance, enlarging public investment, you have instead a situation where even the railways are now being privatized. So far from public investment being increased in order to stimulate the economy, the government is actually withdrawing the role of the public sector, withdrawing the public sector from the role it had been playing even until now. Instead of, for instance, essential services remaining in the public domain, or greater public commitment to providing essential services, you actually find a reduction in public commitment to essential services. As a matter of fact, we had this enormous, huge pandemic, we still have, which is going on. But during this entire pandemic, unlike even in countries like Spain, where the state commandeered private hospitals, as it were, nationalized private hospitals temporarily so that they could actually treat patients free. You have in India the private hospitals continuing, and of course they continue to charge amounts which, even though capped, would not be possible for ordinary working people to afford. So you have just the opposite of what is being now talked about. Similarly, instead of reduction in inequalities, you actually find that, if anything, the government is giving more and more corporate tax concessions, which actually increase the inequalities in post-tax incomes. Likewise, far from respecting labor rights, you have an encroachment on labor rights, a reduction in labor rights, which is utterly shocking, rolling back, as it were, what the working class has achieved after centuries of struggle. And that is something which is there in all the BJP-ruled states, and they would not be having those kinds of reforms in labor laws without the green signal from center. So you find that in countries like ours, and one may even go a bit further, that countries like India, Brazil, Turkey, and so on, these countries, you actually find the opposite happening, far from the need for a reformed capitalism, for a more progressive capitalism. Other than what finance has been dictating all these years, you actually find a greater adherence to the dictates of finance. Now, this is something which, of course, requires for it to be carried through at all. It requires an authoritarian fascistic regime. It requires, at a political level, far greater authoritarianism by fascistic elements, and that is something which you find in India, in Turkey, in Brazil, and so on. But of course, this is not even going to work, because this is not going to stimulate any greater activity. Simply privatizing the public sector doesn't enlarge the level of total investment in the economy at a time when the markets are not growing, when you find that actually the crisis is rampant. Nobody is willing to invest, and therefore, if you privatize public sector assets, they pocket these assets and are perfectly happy to do that without necessarily enlarging their investment one iota. So this is not going to overcome the current crisis, the crisis of unemployment, the crisis of stagnation, which has afflicted the entire world economy and which has therefore afflicted the Indian economy even before the pandemic struck. You must remember that in India, the level of unemployment, even before one even heard of the pandemic, was much larger than it had been at any time in the last 45 years. So this crisis is intense. It's not going to overcome by the kind of measures which the government is taking. But that being the case, since these measures are fundamentally antithetical to the interests of the people, the kind of authoritarian fascistic regime that we have would perforce become more and more authoritarian and fascistic. Therefore, here again, there is going to be an intensification of class struggle, but intensification of class struggle directly at a political level and subsequently, of course, in terms of the economic agenda. But whether we look at countries like ours, whether we look at the advanced countries, the fact that neoliberal capitalism has come to a dead end implies that going beyond it is now going to result in an intensification of class struggle. Now, this is an intensification that I'm sure someone like Amit Sengupta would have expected, joined in, participated, and been an enthusiastic supporter from the side of the working people. Therefore, the fact that we are in that conjuncture, in a sense, represents to my mind a vindication of everything that someone like Amit Sengupta stood for. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity.
Thank you, Prabhat, for explaining to us what is the direction in which the world may be traveling. I think two takeaways from that. One is the need for struggle. It's not going to happen spontaneously. And the need for struggle is the key element of that. The second part of it is also that apart from what we are talking about in terms of finance, capital, and so on, we also have the picture of, for instance, the battle of private property over patents. And we have remdesivir, we already have what the United States has done, but also Gilead's patent. And it's an issue that is also going to be there for vaccines, particularly as unless ICMR's magic formula of 6 weeks vaccine work, which I'm sure Satyajit will have something to say about. I don't. That's the second thrust that we are going to face now. How do you get in this particular way? How do you get the vaccines to the people? Because you need 7.5 billion of them, and this is not just a simple question of manufacture and distribute a few tablets. So that these are the battles that we still need to fight. I therefore request Professor Satyajit Rath, who's from ICER Pune, who has been a part of the people's science movement for a long time, worked with Amit on the issue of biologics in the last part of Amit's work. So I'll request Satyajit to speak to us. What are the scientific challenges, science and society challenges we face today?
Thank you, Prabir. Professor Patnaik has laid out the broad contours of both the current socioeconomic configurations and the effect of the pandemic. And for me, particularly, remembering Amit, the COVID-19 pandemic, it's both its real worries and its imaginary terrors, its solidarities and xenophobias, it challenges us, our perceptions and strategies, at the tangled forefront of public health, technology, and capital. And this was Amit's very own place, this tangled forefront. It's therefore no wonder that ever since March this year, I keep catching myself thinking over and over, again and again, how would Amit have thought about this? A subtext of that thought is my own awareness that while we shared an understanding of the configuration of this landscape, Amit had a far more intense and focused pragmatism of what should be done about this and what can be done about this in the here and now. I'm going to use 3 emblematic stories about COVID-19 in this context. And I'm afraid that you will see my limitations and you will see why I miss Amit like hell in this particular situation. So let me start off, since Prabir brought it up, let me start off with the vaccine story. And like any good story, one starts with the topical. So let us start with the far-famed letter from the Director General of the Indian Council of Medical Research, ICMR. For those of us who have been in deep meditation over these past couple of days and have missed this, let me do a quick recap. The ICMR institution in Pune grew the virus causing COVID-19, SARS-CoV-2, in culture, purified the virus, killed the virus by various chemicals, and that's a vaccine technology. This is a 200-year-old vaccine, well, 150-year-old vaccine technology. They tested it in animals. They found that it generates an immune response in animals, and therefore they transferred it, this vaccine technology, to a private company, Bharat Biotech. Keep in mind that this is exactly how Jonas Salk made the polio vaccine. He grew the virus, he killed the virus, he injected the virus, he got antibodies, and that's the Salk vaccine. And Salk did not patent the vaccine. This is a useful memory. So this was transferred to a private company, Bharat Biotech, in Hyderabad. And together, they've asked for and gotten regulatory approvals for initial clinical trials in humans. For these trials, they seem to have developed partnerships with a dozen or so hospitals. Many of these hospitals are small private hospitals in small cities and towns. And it's not clear if they have either the administrative or the scientific experience to carry out such a trial. They may, but it's not immediately apparent that they certainly do have this. On this background, the Director General of ICMR, who is the head of one of the partners and promoters, promoter organizations for the development of this vaccine, Covaxin, it's called. More accurately, the vaccine candidate. We should not be referring to it as a vaccine until it is licensed. So the Director General ICMR wrote to all these hospitals this past week that this trial is, and I quote, being monitored at the topmost level of the government. And we all know, as Professor Patnaik also made allusion to, what the topmost level of the government is. And he went on, the Director General ICMR, that these hospitals are, and I quote again, strictly advised to fast track all approvals related to this trial, and that, I quote again, non-compliance will be viewed very seriously. Now, effectively, to cut through the bureaucratic verbiage, the government is threatening private parties into taking shortcuts. Oh, I'm sorry, I apologize. Into fast tracking, okay? To give itself publicity brownie points from the ramparts of the Red Fort on Independence Day on the back of a global pandemic. And this is the context, and all of this is in the context of the government having dismantled our capacity, as Professor Patnaik pointed out, over recent decades, in both public manufacturing systems and in public health systems, to the point that it now needs private parties for both R&D, manufacture, and for actual clinical trials of this vaccine candidate. And I'm bringing this up as an absolutely pandemic-driven, specific and narrow exemplification of the broader context of governance that Professor Patnaik laid out for us to begin with. Nor is this simply an Indian phenomenon. Globally, there are 100 efforts at developing SARS-CoV-2 vaccine candidates. The majority are being developed by publicly funded research institutions. And yet, the majority are partnered with private sector manufacturing companies, with an occasional, mostly Chinese exception. The result is a patchwork dominated by special interests, primarily a combination of commercial interests in property rights in these products, on the one hand, and nationalist rather than simply national interests in feeding local revanchist populist narratives. In effect, the prevailing sense is we will ensure that our people get the vaccine and that our companies make money from it. This is despite the fact that the pandemic is global, that it travels rapidly and unpredictably, and that we are all together in and at risk. A rational response would have been to create a coordinated global strategic effort. Instead, globally, we are bashing each other and China for real or imaginary missteps of perceived malign intent, and we are aggressively dismantling the one global multilateral organization we have, however imperfect, for anchoring such an effort, which is the World Health Organization. Now, the USA is quite clearly head and shoulders above in this particular brand of xenophobic insanities, but the WHO has had little enthusiastic support from other countries either. And looking at this, let me therefore shift from my example with respect to vaccines to my example with respect to medications. And I'm not using the term drugs, I'm using the term medications, because not only am I going to talk about hydroxychloroquine, remdesivir, favipiravir, I'm also going to make reference to our very own Baba Ramdev. Consider this on my initial pair of rational evidence-based disavowals, which are, I think, absolutely essential in any of these discussions, particularly because they're not made in public discourse in a viral pandemic. And that is, firstly, there are very few antiviral medications, unlike antibiotics, which work against bacteria, not viruses. And such antiviral medications do not work as dramatically as antibiotics do to improve signs and symptoms of illness. Second, my insistent rational evidence-based disavowal, for most of us, our immunity, whether against viruses or anything else, cannot be easily boosted. This is a term that's very much in public discourse, cannot be easily boosted for beneficial effects without inimical consequences. On this background, what we have as the medical repertoire for COVID-19 sufferers is crucial supportive therapies. Therapies to ease fever and cough, to improve breathing and oxygen supply, to reduce inflammation, and to improve the functioning of affected organs. So what is our major limitation? Our major limitation in dealing with severely ill people suffering from COVID-19 is that as a consequence of the commercialization of healthcare, these supportive therapies, many of which depend on complex structures and resources in medical institutions, are not widely and affordably available. So the rational response would be to organize a globally coordinated effort to produce, transport, deliver, and utilize all such resources for supportive therapies, ranging from oxygen to ventilators, wherever needed. However, such an effort clearly meets neither the demands of market profiteering nor of xenophobic revanchist narratives. So we do not do this, and people suffer and die. Yet, what we have instead is the unedifying spectacle of a sitting president of the United States of America touting an entirely unproven medication, hydroxychloroquine, as a magic remedy for prevention and therapy. This is followed by a worldwide run on hydroxychloroquine, with India's leadership preening about calls from the USA president asking for large-scale supply of the drug. We have a vast scientific effort in the more broad sense worldwide to find a cure for the coronavirus, secure in the long shot hope that if one stumbles on anything that even vaguely resembles such a thing, profits and glory can be raked in with a shovel. We've repurposed drugs, many of them reoriented from other virus infections with no evidence, like favipiravir being approved without evidence by regulatory authorities in India. And as Prabir referred to, we have the sad saga of remdesivir, whose modest utility in a clinical trial gets official publicity from the government of the USA in a press release. The only result of that being an increase in the stock price of the company, Gilead, and a stockpiling of the drug by the USA, causing scarcity outside the USA. We have a situation Amit would have found profoundly ironic, that the only medications that seem to have some strong, though still modest utility as supportive therapies in severe COVID-19 are biologics or old generic drugs. The biologics are not taking off as much as remdesivir, likely because they're hard to manufacture on massive scales. On the other hand, what an extremely well-conducted clinical trial in the UK public health system, mind you, has shown is the completely unsurprising finding that anti-inflammatory steroid medication is of modest help in severe COVID-19. And then, on this background of patchily evidence-based lopsided commercial hype, we have our own Baba Ramdev and his ilk, both outside and inside the government, who have gone from exceptionalist claims of Indians have special immunity to traditional Indian secret knowledge can boost special immunity to provide seamless integration of the profiteering marketplace with terrified nativist xenophobia. For profiteering global capital, there is no such thing as community. There are only gullible consumers. And for nativist xenophobia, community is a glorified, if not sacralized abstraction, not real living human beings. The outcome of this combined blindness is our third and my final point in parables about COVID-19. And that is our community health response to COVID-19. Prabir, how long do I have?
5 minutes.
Okay. That's so let me then very quickly talk about what we have done about the human and the humane resources for identify, trace, isolate, which is the core of the immediate public health response to the pandemic. Do we know what we need as public policies to slow down the pandemic so that we have the space and resources to take good care of the few who become severely ill? Yes, we do. We need to persuade ourselves as communities to practice sustainable physical distancing and social solidarity. And we need to identify infected individuals, isolate them sustainably, identify and trace their contacts, test and isolate them sustainably. How do we do this? We need people, local people from communities with a network of trust, trained with the necessary skills for this purpose, working full-time with the dignity and assurance of employment. Do we have those? Here is a piece of arithmetic. The general calculation in the prosperous societies of the global north, mind you, is that it would take one such community health worker per 3,000 population. Do we have this? No. Have we made provision for this? Yes, according to governments, both local, regional, and central. How? By sending untrained primary school teachers from government schools on public health duties instead, on COVID duties, as they are called everywhere in communities. Why not? Why haven't we made better provision for this? Because we have decided that public sector employment is anathema. In fact, we have decided that the responsibilities of the state, of the governments, of us as societies in public health is itself anathema. Having done this, how then are we doing case finding, contact tracing, and isolation? We are doing this by using the police to enforce draconian containment zones. We have converted, therefore, public health problem into a law and order problem. Have we provided even sufficient technical resources for such an effort? And here is my very last example of how the marketplace is driving our public health pandemic responses. Everybody is familiar with the test for COVID-19. This is an RT-PCR test, and of the 200 and something different kits available in the world, the overwhelming majority depend on the availability of a specialized instrument called a thermal cycler. Is there no alternative? There is. Are there kits available? Very few. Why is this? And the only reason one can plausibly come up with is that the marketplace has decided that the best way of maximizing profiteering return from the pandemic is to market a test that depends on an expensive instrument, so as to diversify your profit portfolio. So here's a common picture on our urban streets these days. We are crowding shopping areas. We are pushing and pulling. We are not wearing masks except on our chins in public places. And what are we shopping for? We are shopping for expensive magic remedies from medicine shops called immunity boosters. We are buying groceries. We are buying them all carefully plastic packaged, and we are bringing them home and sanitizing them with yet another bunch of quasi-magic remedies called sanitizers. And we don't find this picture odd. What on earth are we doing? We are paying no heed to actions that would slow down the spread of the virus and limit the numbers of people who are seriously ill at one time. Physical, not social. Physical distancing, face and nose coverings, frequent soap and water hand washing are societal responsibilities that even those of us who can do so do not fulfill. What do we do instead? We're terrified that I will catch corona and die of it. Faced with a problem that screams for worldwide community solidarity, we decide that the market will save us. We decide that each one of us is going to protect themselves individually, and we decide that we will do this by buying a piece of magic from the market. We decide that it is not our responsibility to protect other people. We decide that actually other people are responsible for this problem because they are dirty, slovenly, evil, other, not like us. As societies and states, we exclude them. We exclude rather than truly caring for those of us who are fallen enough to be infected. To those of us who have to work each day to be able to eat each day, we say, oh, don't worry, we will forgive the non-existent loans you have taken and will soon pay you the dues that we as governments should have paid long ago. In the meanwhile, we worry over and rejoice in the vagaries of the money market. And even more oddly and depressingly, we don't find this picture odd either. You know, Amit would have laughed with me, but then he would have, and all of us who knew him will remember this, he would have tossed his cigarette stub away. He would have rolled up his sleeves and said, okay, let's start. And we start with this, and then this, and then this, and then this. Damn, is it any wonder I miss the man? Thank you.
Well, I think Satyajit has done a wonderful, depressing presentation of what the pandemic is doing to us as a society, partially to offset the optimistic hope that Prabhat had given us, that the crisis is so bad that we will then go out and fight it, change society. Of course, I'm being a little facetious on this, but I must say, Satyajit, I hope that you haven't depressed the people too much, and we still come back and do what Amit would have done, roll up our sleeves and fight the way to better health and changing society. I'm going to, of course, the reason of Satyajit's anger is also this is his discipline, immunology, right? So that's also partly the reason why he's so unhappy. Like all of us unhappy with Coronil, but also with ICMR. I'm going to turn to Dr. Thelma Narayan, who's been trained both as a physician and also in public health. She's a leading figure in public health, having worked on health and equality issues over 4 decades. She's also co-founded the well-known community health organization, Sochara. Thelma, I hope you will leave us with some hope that yes, we can actually fight this, both this disease and the societal diseases facing us, and there is hope for us yet.
Thank you so much for organizing this. And I feel that on the occasion of this book launch, and which happens to be on Amit's birthday, we do rededicate ourselves as members of JSA, PHM, and all allied organizations to the cry of working towards health for all in a very unequal world. I think we have been part of the same generation as Amit was, except that I was at Bangalore and he was elsewhere. It was the Alma Ata Declaration of 1978, which was, as you know, launched by WHO and UNICEF, but actually driven by a group of professionals who had very strong socialist moorings. Dr. Hafton Mahler, the then WHO DG, and others who were part of that group actually wrote a wonderful document, which I think should be read by all, because it was not only did they write the document, they got about 134 countries to commit to it, India being also one of the signatories. But as in, the 40 years have taught us all the deceit, doublespeak, barriers, hurdles, trade wars, etc., that actually have not allowed this dream to come to fruition. But I would say this book that has been launched today is really a must read for all activists, all health activists, all scholars, and all academicians. It's a wonderful recap of the work that Amit has done, and also that so many other people who have been part of writing up the book and editing the book have put together, and I would really applaud them for this. I would also applaud Tripta and Arijit for setting up a fellowship, because the fellowship is something that helps in creating and supporting young people who are entering in the field or have already worked for some time. So I think both the book and the fellowships together are a sign of hope. I think I fully agree with the analysis put forward by the previous two speakers, Professor Patnaik and Satyajit Rath, in a very articulate sort of manner. And I would like to remember that actually, when he mentioned Jonas Salk, when he was asked whether he would patent the polio vaccine, he said no, but can you patent the sun, was his response. And he did not patent the vaccine. Now, public health is actually, the protection of public health of every citizen is really the key responsibility of all governments. And in our own constitution, it's written in. So when we are fighting for the right to health and for social justice and equity in health, we are fighting for our own constitution. We are not doing anything anti-national, which unfortunately some of us are being accused of. The whole Health for All movement, I believe, actually started years before the 1978 declaration. If you go back to the subcommittee by Sokhi, the Sokhi subcommittee, which has been mentioned, set up in 1938 as a health subcommittee of the first National Planning Committee. While it was chaired by Jawaharlal Nehru, it was actually set up under the presidency of Subhash Chandra Bose. I say this with some pride because my father was in the INA. And I feel that the health rights movement is a continuation of a freedom struggle that we have not yet reached the full goal of. We've got political independence, but not necessarily health rights as yet. So we have to continually work for this. It is an achievable goal. I wouldn't say it's not achievable. And I would cite the example of Kerala in its recent response to the COVID epidemic. I've just worked with two postgraduates who are actually at the Achyuta Menon Center, and we've reviewed what has been done by the state of Kerala. I think many of you have been reading about it, but I will just very briefly mention that Kerala learned, this has developed over a few decades actually, starting with the decentralization in Kerala, 40% of the health funding going to Gram Panchayats and to the Panchayat bodies. It goes to setting up of the Kudumbashri, which was a huge and the largest women force that is there in any part of the world actually, but definitely it's very effective. People have told us how they have provided food and support to so many people who are either in quarantine or self-isolation, or even the guest workers, as they nicely call the migrant workers. They have got the Ardharam program, which is a family health unit based program in the health system, which is a wonderful way of strengthening the health system, the public health system. And they have learned from the Zika virus outbreak as well as from the floods. And therefore, their methods of surveillance, their methods of tracking and contact tracing in a very, very systematic way and in a supportive way. It's not a top-down, coercive, sort of frightening experience, but in a supportive way. That's a reality, and there have been many testimonies to this. There are many people who've written about their experience in this regard. And I think the political leadership as well as the professional leadership has been quite phenomenal in Kerala. We have compared Kerala, the population of Kerala, with other countries which have a similar population, and the outcome indicators of COVID-19 in Kerala are actually very much, in fact, they're very good, and as good as many others like in Cambodia, Vietnam, South Korea, etc. So I think that is a positive story. And some people may say that it's something like a social vaccine, where all sectors of society come together and actually work together. But this was not a magic wand. This is something that Kerala has a long tradition of various movements, social movements that have made this possible, the literacy movement being one of them. Now, coming to the life and work of Amit actually honed his skills through the literacy movement and the science movement. So he was I would say, a par excellence scholar activist. It's a sort of dream that some of us have, but he had the capacity to actually embody this in his life. So he had, over the years, through these two movements, developed the skills of mass mobilization and communicating with people in a very sort of easy way. He could demystify complex issues, whether they are with intellectual property rights or whether it was with the WTO and all the negotiations that went with it, the drug pricing issue, and later even to issues of global governance and all the contradictions that happen in global governance, the vested interests and how they play. His wonderful little booklet on pillage in a global village is well remembered for the way he put across his arguments, And I think that was a very unusual skill that he had, that he could apply an academic rigor and with great clarity demystify it through a process of sort of popular education, so that people got mobilized and motivated around the whole issue. So we've been associated with him. I've known him since the 1980s. And in fact, much before the formation of the Jan Swasthya Abhiyan and the Global People's Health Movement. And we all worked very closely together in forming of the Jan Swasthya Abhiyan, because at that time, after several decades of working towards health for all, it was felt that we were not yet a countervailing movement. We were not a countervailing power to alter any of the policies or paradigms that were existing. So we all worked within our circles, whether it was the Medico Friends Circle, the All India Drug Action Network. There were a whole range of other networks that were also. So bringing together these diverse networks into a common platform, which was the Jan Swasthya Abhiyan, and still is one of the strongest networks in the world, I would say, on public health issues or issues concerning public health. That was quite a turning point in 2000. And why 2000? Because of the WHO goal of health for all by 2000 AD. And in the year 2000 AD, but WHO had happily forgotten about it, and they had safe blood as their theme of the year. WHO has renegated quite a bit on many of their commitments, as many international bodies do. But WHO is still important to us for public health, and therefore we need to reclaim WHO for public health, even particularly at this time of COVID. So the Jan Swasthya Abhiyan, and Amit played a huge role with his mobilizing capacities and the intellectual capacities, but it was his also ability to keep groups together. So, and his general good humor, and so became a sort of a go-to person in the running of the movement. So the movement was something that I think has played a significant role, particularly in the formation of the National Rural Health Mission. It helped in the design of the mission, and particularly in the communitization of the public health system. This was the first time this was being done at such a scale in India. It's probably one of the first even globally, where the formation of this huge group of ashas. Now, many of us feel we have about 1 million ashas, accredited social health activists. I think the full form of that should be understood. They were social health activists, but they were often converted into simple community workers. It's an all women group. They are being unfairly treated. They are not being remunerated for their work. They have to work in very difficult circumstances. And right now, in the COVID response, they are the front line workers, and they're doing it with immense courage and strength. And they're not shying away from their work. They're stepping up and actually working together with the ANMs, together with the auxiliary nurse midwives. There's so many frontline workers. And I would say even the common policeman, the constabulary is also a frontline worker. They are not responsible for the higher power dynamics that go on. These are rural men who are seeking an employment. So they need to be protected as much as any other. However, I would say in the times of COVID has shown a light, as people have mentioned in the previous two speakers, on the inequalities that exist and the huge lacunae that exist in terms of our understanding and knowledge. We are not, the first thing is, I would say we don't have an adequate budgetary support to public health in India. And that should be the first and foremost item on the campaign agenda for the future. That it is crucial for everybody, including the elite, to have a strong public health system. So we have to have, but we are particularly focused on the need of workers, including the healthcare workers, who are at the greatest risk at this point of time. So having adequate funding, adequate budgetary, now I know in this neoliberal economic paradigm in which we operate, I wouldn't know how to change that other than the struggle. But I think we have to make the argument on evidence-based approach that these inequalities for health are actually no good for anybody. And it's no good even for the developed world because of the transmissibility of infectious diseases. So the second thing is we have to strengthen institutions that are crucially important, public institutions that are important. And we all know that institutions such as the IDPL, the Hindustan Antibiotics Limited, the BCG unit, vaccine production unit in Guindy, have all been systematically decimated, closed down. Now we have to reverse that trend and ensure that these public institutions that have been built up at great, with a lot of effort, really continue their work that they need to do. Because in times of COVID, and I can assure you there will be further infectious disease epidemics, these are crucial to our well-being. There have been epidemics in the past, and WHO had, and many countries, and India has also signed on to that we should have a pandemic preparedness group and a plan. We have not done this. So the question is, why has India not done adequate pandemic preparedness? And this was initiated soon after SARS, which was in 2003 or so. Who is holding to account the government, the department, the ministries of health, and the larger system to not have these crucial things in position? Because this is an absolute necessity, and unless there's some secret mission about which none of us know, I don't know about any pandemic preparedness unit that was existing prior to this current pandemic. Public health has also to be seen from an ethical standpoint. That things like containment, quarantine, lockdowns can be very coercive and very authoritarian. They can infringe on the rights of people. They can cause stigma and discrimination. And therefore, it's extremely important that any action that's taken is proportionate to the risk that is there, and that it is held democratically accountable. I'm speaking in particular about the lockdown, which was brought in with a 4-hour notice. And this was I would say doesn't pass any of the ethical tests. Neither does it pass the public health test. While one does not deny that a lockdown in certain areas in a graded manner is necessary, but the way it was done across the country in regions where the pandemic hadn't even touched, and with thousands, millions of migrant workers, there are some estimates that say that we have about 120 million migrant workers, and at least, substantial proportion were walking. Now, what sort of public health is that? It's giving the country that is not public health. So the consequences of this public health action are being faced by families across the country, and that has to be restored. There has to be restorative justice to all the people who have suffered as a result of that action. And it is incumbent on the government, which took that measure, to ensure that restorative justice is done to them, not some form of charity that we are going to give them 1,000 rupees per month or give them 5 kgs of rice, which all of us know doesn't last very long, and it doesn't get there in the first place. So these are the ethical, public health ethical issues that need to be discussed and that need to be in the public domain. I would say the other issue in terms of surveillance is the anonymization of data. Because right now, and the issues of privacy, we cannot say that in an emergency that we will just make this public and everybody. So people are so scared of so if they have a fever, they are not going to go and tell somebody immediately because they're very scared of all these lal battis coming to their house and them being caught up in that whole thing. So now coming lastly to the WHO. WHO has a very important role along with national governments in terms of ensuring fair and universal access to diagnostics, treatments, and vaccines, which are rational. I mean, I would go completely with what Satyajit Rath just said, that whether it's dexamethasone or these supportive medical treatments, they have to be accessible to all. We know right from all the media reporting that it's not accessible to all. So how do we get these systems operational, just as Kerala has done? So it's not a pipe dream. This is something that has been put in place in our own country and is being upheld worldwide actually as a model. To some extent, even Dharavi in Mumbai has done things quite nicely, and they have slowed the transmission of the spread of the epidemic in that region, in that community. So we have to ensure that these fair and equitable access is available to all these treatments to all. I think I may be running out of time. Could you just tell me, Prabir? 2 minutes? Yeah, okay. So maybe with that, I would just like to probably, suggest that everybody read the book because it contains a lot of very valuable information, and maybe join JSA. Those of you who aren't already on JSA, read the JSA Discuss. It's a very active group that is discussing issues all the time. There are a series of wonderful statements that get put out. Dr. Sundaraman is now the global chair of the People's Health Movement. And there are umpteen number of people who are actively involved with this. So I would suggest join the movement. We'll keep Amit's legacy alive and draw strength from his life and work and draw inspiration from his life and work. He did leave us far too early and we miss him a lot. Yes.
Thank you, Thelma, for giving us this, what shall we say, 360-degree view of the health system, public health issues that are confronting us, and also talking about health movement and Amit. And I must say that particularly as we are here today, the other element of his life was the people's science movement. From what you said, he came from that origin. And then, of course, a people's health movement also had a, shall we say, a starting, one part of that started also from the People's Science Network. So yes, science activist, health activist, is important that we come together. I would also, before we end today, I would like Harendra, who's the person who's been selected for the fellowship, to speak a few words to us, and after which we will close the meeting. Harendra, over to you for a couple of minutes.
नमस्ते, मेरा नाम हरेंद्र है। उपस्थित आदरणीय सभी जन एवं मेरे प्रिय साथी, मैं हरेंद्र सिजवाली वर्तमान समय में जन स्वास्थ्य सहयोग छत्तीसगढ़ में अपनी सेवाएं प्रदान कर रहा हूं और साथ ही जन स्वास्थ्य अभियान छत्तीसगढ़ का सदस्य हूं। मन में लोगों के स्वास्थ्य एवं स्वास्थ्य के अधिकार के लिए और कुछ करने की चाह थी। इस काम को कर सकने के लिए मुझे डॉक्टर अमित सेनगुप्ता स्वास्थ्य अधिकार फेलोशिप में एक अवसर दिखाई दिया। इसी अभिलाषा से मैंने इस आवेदन को किया था। मैं सभी चयनकर्ताओं का आभार प्रकट करता हूं। उन्होंने मुझे इस फेलोशिप हेतु उपयुक्त समझकर मेरा चयन किया। निश्चित ही यह मेरे लिए खुशी और गर्व की बात है। अपने कंधों पर आए इस दायित्व को बखूबी निभाने के लिए मैं अपनी प्रतिबद्धता भी व्यक्त करता हूँ। पुनः एक बार आप सभी को मेरा धन्यवाद और पुनः आश्वासन कि मैं इस फेलोशिप का सदुपयोग लोक कल्याण के काम में कर सकूं, इसका मान रखूंगा। धन्यवाद।
Thank you, Harendra, for being or taking on this onerous responsibility. हमारी इस जिम्मेदारी जो अमित हम सब पे छोड़ गए हैं, उसको पूरा आगे ले जाने के लिए और पूरा करने के लिए धन्यवाद। अब आशा है कि आप हम लोगों के बाद इस काम को ले पाएंगे, क्योंकि हम लोगों तो खैर बहुत दिन नहीं है, सिर्फ भाषण के अलावा हम खास कुछ कर नहीं सकते इस वक्त। अब क्या कहते हैं, आजकल कोमॉर्बिडिटीज में काफी परेशान है। बाहर निकल हम वी आर सपोज्ड टू बी प्रोटेक्टेड, वी आर नॉट सपोज्ड टू गो आउट एनीवेयर, वी शुड बी पुट with cotton wool above and below. That's how we are supposed to be kept. So it's hopefully the younger ones who will take the struggle forward. I'm going to leave this today because I see that for once, we are 5 minutes before time. I had targeted that we'll finish by 6:30. I must really thank all the speakers for being within time. And I'm now going to ask Indranil to give the vote of thanks and close the meeting. Indranil, 2 minutes for a vote of thanks, and that's it. We close the meeting after that.
Okay. Thanks, Provida. And like always, you have this last minute googly to me. I am not prepared at all, but it's a very, I think, I would say that I should first thank you for thinking this through, that we need to put this together, bring this volume together. It's a big moment for me personally to be able to contribute. I think Geeta needs to be specially thanked, and also because she and other colleagues helped us in actually putting all of this together, literally teaching us what it takes to write a book and publishing it. Leftword also at the last moment they pitched in and agreed to publish. There were so many comrades and friends in NewsClick who have contributed. Gargia helped us initially with the book. And it's a really overwhelming moment for all of us. I must be missing many. I must also, I think, there are other comrades who have helped in, and also the authors who have really poured their heart and thoughts. Sarojini, Iqbal, David, Susanna, Comrade Majumdar, and many others, Kailaji. There are so many people who have contributed and been able to put this together. Avilasha and also all of it was a collective work. We really enjoyed this together. I hope you guys, all of you, read it and join Science and Health movement. Thank you so much.
And I must also say that it was with a lot of pain that we finished the book. So let's not say we enjoyed the making of the book. It was a pain to get to finish the book so that everybody, who has participated must have felt the irritation that I was bugging them continuously on various things. So with that, I'm going to close this meeting and hope that we can take forward the tasks that have been left to us by this untimely passing of Amit Sengupta, and also for finally having a book of articles that he had written, which he unfortunately never put together. That's it. We close this meeting. Thank you all so much for joining us. Those who have joined us on YouTube, those who have joined us on Facebook, and all the organizations who have hosted this meeting, who made this meeting possible, this virtual book release possible. That's it from us. Thank you very much.